Okay, so that should be preparing itself. We've got 23 in here. And I'm going to try to close that down. Meeting is streaming. Okay. So guys, I'll share my screen now again. This one. And right, and we'll go. So welcome everyone to the to our, I think it's the 10th lecture in this series, the Centenary series. So we're delighted, of course, to keep this up. It's really, we're getting into the nitty-gritty at this stage now, to be honest, with the details of 1921. Is everybody muted? I don't think so. Okay, so anyway, so as I say, we're now into March, so it does get, we're getting into the weeds, and of course there's violence almost every single day, so we can't recount all of the violence, but we certainly will do most of it. So the first 6 months, we said this a couple of times, of 1921 was the most violent period in the Irish War of Independence. We looked, of course, at 1920 and how actually just towards the end of that year, there was a possibility that the violence would end. There were secret talks between intermediaries of Lloyd George's government and Sinn Féin, and Arthur Griffith in particular, and so there was an offer of Dominion status, which of course we know this was later on offered to De Valera in June, and it wasn't acceptable. So still being a member of the Commonwealth. You can see here, this is a cartoon from the Sinn Féin perspective, that the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, which they are starting to calm down. Don't forget, Ireland is already partitioned now so the north of Ireland is starting to have its own kind of its own government, or certainly people coming in to examine what that would look like. And they're saying here that John Bull can wade through a sea of Irish blood. Talks did stall, however, on the insistence of Hammer Greenwood. He was the Chief Secretary for Ireland, because he was insisting that the IRA would have to first surrender the weapons. Neville MCCready, who was the British Army commander in Ireland at the time, was of the impression actually that any kind of truce would only strengthen the IRA. Now, this is all November, December 1920. So McCready was pressing for martial law, which was in fact instituted in parts of Ireland in the late 1920s, 1920, and he wanted that to be given a chance to try to, deliver these results. Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister, the Welsh wizard, gave in. And so Crown forces were then given the task, sort of over Christmas, of crushing the IRA before the talks could actually resume. So the IRA's success would lie in forcing the British government to talk to their leaders without preconditions. But that achievement, which they do achieve over the next 6 months, costs about 1,000 lives between January and July of 21. So the war was at its most intense, we said, in Munster, and martial law had been declared in certain counties by late 1920. In March 1921, the British commander McCready wrote, "The rebels in the martial law area carry out operations which frequently resemble a minor military engagement, as distinct from small ambushes formed by men who shot and ran away." So this, we said, was kind of down to the fact that the flying columns were formed in the late 1920s, which meant larger and more regular kind of engagements between the guerrillas and British forces. In County Cork, there were large-scale ambushes at Coolavig and Clonbanon. 11 policemen died at Drumkeen ambush in County Limerick. And of course, in County Kerry, there was an ambush on a train carrying troops at Headford Junction, which killed 9 soldiers and wounded 25. But these flying columns, which we said, were kind of men, maybe up to 20 or 30, they would go in and then kind of hide again in the hills, they were on the run. Sometimes would have to march for 2 or 3 days, particularly, Cork and Kerry over the mountains and things. This gives the British forces the opportunity to kind of, if they were successful in hunting them down, to capture relatively large numbers of guerrilla fighters. So Tom Barry's 3rd Cork Brigade column, for instance, had about 100 men. This was almost trapped by a British sweep where the British had more than 1,000 men at Crossbarry in March. They did manage to fight, they're very clear, and we'll talk about it later on, killing a number of British soldiers. So we said last month, we talked about this, the Clonmult ambush, which had been a disaster for the IRA. 20 strong in the flying column, at 5 were killed in combat. This house, you know, was kind of set fire while they were in there, and so some of them surrendered. In fact, after they surrendered, 7 of them were shot by the auxiliaries. 6 volunteers were shot dead after capture when they were surprised at Claheen. So this had been a kind of a serious disaster down in Cork. And you know, people were kind of rife looking for revenge. This was in February. As the British deployed more troops and resources to the south, then the character of the conflict began to change. The British troops were using now aerial reconnaissance and mounted huge drives of thousands of troops across the countryside. And they also began to deploy active service platoons in kind of smaller numbers to try to hunt these flying columns. So these methods meant that large-scale ambushes and barracks attacks, which had been sort of the early days in 1919, became much more difficult for the Munster units to pull off. So it forced them to concentrate on small-scale shootings and bombings in these final months. In a letter written to the Times during the Troubles, Lord Hugh Thettle, who was a famous sort of unionist, once wrote that the true cause, quote, of the murders in Ireland was not a political grievance, but a widespread moral depravity. A depravity whose abominable crimes he could trace back from Sinn Féin through to the White Boys of the 18th century. The great remedies for such crimes, he said, were law and religion. McCready, who we met, the last British commander in Ireland, recalled his experiences during the Troubles. Red murder, he declared, stalked through the length and breadth of the land. Everyone in the IRA was an actual or potential murderer. Murderous methods are actually indigenous to the soil of Ireland. Of course, the IRA had a different viewpoint. Almost unconsciously, wrote Major Florence O'Donoghue, the army evolved for itself the method of fighting best suited to its organisations, arms, and state of training. The only method with which it gave any hope of survival or success, guerrilla warfare. And so this is why those flying columns, you know, evolved, because they just were not able to engage. And we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end too, about, you know, particularly De Valera. Now, Nehru in India was closely observing this nascent kind of home rule or republicanism in Ireland, and he expressed it as a mere handful of young men and women with the sympathy of their people behind them fought against fantastic odds. A great and organised empire was against them. Ireland became one huge field of conflict where both parties vied with each other in violence and destruction. Behind one of the parties was the organised strength of an empire. Behind the other was the iron resolve of a handful of men. So it came about that 3,000 roughly that were active in the IRA, only a small portion of whom at any one time, because of the desperate shortage of arms, could take part in the field, pinned down about 60,000 combined British forces, as well as the 15,000 well-armed kind of black and tan and auxiliary police. Such was their prowess that whatever the contempt of politicians in London, British field commanders had a healthy respect for the skill and courage of the IRA. So even in April of 1920, the Viceroy, Lord French himself a professional soldier, declared that Sinn Féin had an army numbering 100,000. Properly organised in regiments and brigades led by disciplined officers, they are a formidable army. So that was, you know, a fantastic exaggeration. But by allowing or by leading French to make that exaggerated claim, Sinn Féin kind of scored considerable propaganda victories with that. General Strickland, the British commander in the Cork area, reported that the formations of the Republican force were almost as well organised as those of the British Army. Michael Collins took pride in observing that the IRA fought as far as possible, quote, according to the rules of war. And this was very important because we said last week, you know, De Valera was very kind of concerned with this guerrilla warfare. Collins's claim on behalf of his own men was corroborated by the high British military authority. Neville MCCready, who we've already seen, praised the strict sobriety and self-discipline of the IRA. He claimed they never were involved in looting or in confiscation of private property. And his opinion was shared by General Sir Henry Lawson. The officers of the IRA were, they said, transparently sincere and single-minded, idealists, highly religious for the most part, with an almost mystical sense of duty to their country. They fought against drunkenness and self-indulgence. As a class, they represented all that was best in the countryside. The Irish Republican Army, Lawson said, perhaps thinking of the Black and Tans when he wrote this, seemed to be particularly free from ruffians of the professional type. Behind their organization, there is the spirit of a nation which is certainly not in favor of murder, but which on the whole sympathizes with them and believes that the members of the IRA are fighting for the cause of the Irish people. So, we've talked about this before. The IRA have their, or Sinn Féin certainly had a propaganda campaign, but they seem even to be winning over sort of the whole idea of the British Army. And I think it was becoming more and more obvious, certainly by March of 21, that it was going to be very difficult to sort of break the spirit of the nation, not to mind the soldiers who numbered anywhere between 3,000 and 100,000, according to the British. So Sean McCowan, one of the first disasters that we'll talk about in March, who was the hero of Clonfin, which we discussed last month, up in Roscommon, was captured in Mullingar at a railway station on the 2nd of March, imprisoned and sentenced to death for the murder of an RIC district inspector, McGrath, who was shot at Anne Martin Street in January 1921. In June of 1921, Wilson was petitioned for clemency by McCowan's mother, who referred to her son as John and not Sean in her letter. His own brother Jeremy sent a letter, and the Church of Ireland vicar from their parish, who had said that he was passing on appeals because of his respect for the mother. 3 auxiliaries had actually given character references on his behalf because he had treated them very chivalrously at the Clonfin ambush. I don't know if you remember, but he let those who survived, he tended to their wounds, and like they didn't kind of pick off anyone that was injured. And so, it was a sort of a friendlier encounter than other ones. Neville MCCready, however, this British commander-in-chief, confirmed the death sentence, and he described McCowan as nothing more than a murderer. He wrote that he was probably responsible for other atrocities, although he did record later in his memoirs that McCowan was the only IRA man he had met, aside from Michael Collins, who seemed to have a sense of humour. McCowan wrote a letter to his friend and who had been a classmate of his at Moyne Latin School, a priest, Jim Sheridan, who had actually been a member of the old IRA but had been sent out to Milwaukee to study theology. So on hearing of his death sentence, McCowan said, "Dear Jim, last week I was tried, convicted and sentenced to die 3 weeks from today. My poor mother was here yesterday to request that my body be turned over to her for Christian burial. They refused. Told her that my body would be buried in quicklime in the prison yard. If you write immediately, I will receive your letter before I die. Farewell, Jim. Pray for my soul." According to Oliver St. John Gogarty, Charles Bewley wrote on McCowan's death sentence speech. Michael Collins did jump in to try to arrange a rescue attempt. 6 IRA volunteers, led by Emmett Dalton, Pictured, and Paddy O'Daly, managed to capture a British armoured car. They put on British Army uniforms and gained access to Mountjoy prison. But McCowan was not in the part of the jail that they had gotten into, and after some shooting, the party were able to retreat. Within days, McCowan actually won a seat to Dáil Éireann for Longford and Westmeath in the 1921 election, and happily was released from prison along with the other members of the Dáil after Collins threatened to break off treaty negotiations with the British government unless he were freed. So later in 1921, when they were, the truce is called in 21, or the kind of laying down of the arms in July, and then they were able to kind of get the prisoners out. It was rumoured that Sean McCowan was going to be the best man at Michael Collins's wedding. Now, this is one of the biggest ambushes of March 1921, very early, March 5th. And it was one of the most strategically important victories for the IRA in the whole of the 2 years. So they ended up killing Brigadier General Cummings, who was one of the highest ranked British officers to die in the War of Independence. Only 2 hours of fighting. Death figures have been kind of disputed between the British numbers and the Irish numbers. Sinn Féin said that 13 British were dead and 15 wounded. The Republicans suffered no casualties, but official British reports laid the dead at only 4. Although there was, at the time, the newspapers reported slightly higher deaths. So in March of 21, Sean Moylan was head of the Newmarket flying column, made the decision to ambush a British party of senior officers and their military guard returning from an inspection tour in Kerry. He decided to go there in Clonbanan near Derrinagree, which was 5 miles from Kanturk, which was a kind of a risky situation because there was a strong military post there and there was one in Mill Street, which had RIC and Black and Tan. So they were quite close to 2 separate kind of strongholds and not far from the Kerry ones on the border. So at 3 a.m. on the morning of the 3rd, Moylan's column marched out for Clonbanan and was in position by 3 a.m. By 6 a.m. They were joined at the intersection by the Kerry No. 2 Brigade under Commandant Tom McEllistrom. That's McEllistrom over there. And a detachment from the Kerry No. 2 Brigade column, the Charleville, battalion column under Commandant Paddy O'Brien. The Newmarket and Charleville units occupied positions on the northern side of the road, and the Kerrymen and a section of Mill Street had positions on the south side. They had 1 Hotchkiss gun, which they had captured from Mallow, manned by Bill Moylan and Dennis Galvin. The remainder of the Mill Street column occupied a position covering the roads from Kanturk because they expected reinforcements to come from that direction. The local companies provided scouting and protective elements. So there was probably about 100 men involved in this. Commandant Paddy O'Brien sort of sent all the sections to their positions, and Moylan, then Sean Moylan, I'll just show you these boys. That's Cummings there touring in Kerry. And Commandant Moylan arranged for laying about half a dozen mines along the road. At 7 a.m. the column was ready for action. Strict instructions had been given to the section commanders that they were not to open fire on any target until a mine had exploded, and that the explosion would be the signal for the attack. This was necessary because of a decision come to by Moylan and O'Brien that a very small British force passing through the position would not be attacked because they wanted to get this larger target that they thought was coming. So at 10 a.m, now they've been kind of lying in wait all night, and the Cork boys had to march there. They got the signal that 3 lorries were approaching from the east, and this was unexpected, but Moylan decided they would attack. As the leading lorry drove over the mine, which was controlled by Moylan, he pressed the switch, but there was no explosion. At the same moment, O'Brien, covering the driver, pressed the trigger of his rifle, and the rifle refused to fire. Incredibly, these 3 lorries passed through the ambush position totally safe and not realizing how close to death they had come. In fact, one of the soldiers on the back of the lorry was playing the accordion, and they could hear the soldiers singing, and blissfully unaware. So it turns out that the mine had not gone off because they were using high tension wires, but with a low tension battery. So it was still early in the day. Those 3 trucks hadn't been actually anticipated. They weren't part of they got word from a bartender in Kerry, like what they were expecting. So they decided they would wait for what they had expected to come. At 2:15 that afternoon, their patience paid off. A convoy was signalled coming from the west. Again, 3 lorries, but an armoured car with the touring car. And this seemed to suggest that there was a VIP attached. The vehicles were spaced as they had anticipated. And so they kind of knew we have to wait until, you know, they all get past the initial mine and when they're in the kind of hot spot. So no attempt was made at this point to use the mines because they hadn't worked the first time. So they fired on the first lorry, killing the driver. The Hotchkiss then gun kind of managed to shoot in through the armoured car. The driver was wounded and that car ditched. The remaining vehicles halted, their occupants dismounting rapidly and trying to find cover. The British took serious casualties under this volley of fire and were kind of pinned down around these 5 vehicles. Moylan or someone of the volunteers called on the British to surrender, and the man who they still hadn't identified and who they actually thought might have been, oh, I just said his name, his name will come to me in a second. They thought it was Strickland, but it wasn't Strickland. General Cummings, who was actually a very hated figure, shouted, "To hell with surrender, give them the lead, boys." So fitting last words for a soldier. A round caught him in the head and killed him outright. He had been driving with a hostage, a man called Morris Slattery, who was able to get over the wall and actually managed to escape. Another man in an officer's uniform was seen to jump from the touring car and run for cover on the north side of the road, and that was in fact Brigadier General Cummings. So the action intensified and developed into this duel that went on for about 2 hours. The armoured car was ditched and its heavy machine gun was still being able to use, though, even though, it had fallen on its side. So the machine gun was firing at the Irish for the entire time. The opposing forces were about equal in strength, but the British did have heavier weapons and a far better supply, of course, of ammunition. So the armoured car commanded the road and prevented 2 efforts made by the IRA to drive in the flanks of the British position. The British forces attempted an outflanking manoeuvre, but was defeated by IRA fire. So they were just kind of pinned down and exchanging these shots. The British did have the advantage of a deep ditch, while the Kerry and Cork men were kind of scattered along both sides of the road. So the IRA were not able to take the armoured car or its machine gun out of action, and they were sort of conscious that there would probably be reinforcements coming at any moment from either of the barracks that were only 5 miles away. You could hear probably the firing in Newmarket or Kanturk, so they were worried about reinforcements. Buttevant, which was General Cummings' brigade headquarters, was only 25 miles away, and this fight had gone on now for 2 hours. So as dusk drew in, the IRA decided to withdraw. The Kerry and Mill Street units went west, Newmarket and Charleville headed north to Kiskeen. And again, figures are disputed, but it appears that maybe 13-ish British soldiers, casualties were killed and 15 wounded. There's Cummings who was killed, but the IRA had no deaths or casualties. This was the headline in the New York Times on March 7th, 2 days after the event. So it's interesting, to see exactly how much coverage was actually happening here in America of these, kind of individual battles, like. And there's the monument. Let Aaron remember. So that was Strickland, who they thought they were going to get, but he features in the next story too. So I sort of mentioned last month about spies and the IRA involvement with them, or how there had been kind of an uptick in the executions of people who were perceived to be spies. Cork for sure saw the greatest number of alleged informants being killed, 78 probably. In at least one case, this woman, an elderly Protestant loyalist, Mrs. Lindsay, who had tried to warn local leaders, in particular Strickland, about an IRA ambush. The Cork IRA proceeded with her execution in direct defiance of their own leadership in Dublin. So this is kind of an interesting little, push-pull within the IRA. Mary or Maria Georgina Lindsay was 60 when she was executed by the IRA in March 1921. So in the press in Ireland, particularly obviously the loyalist press, she was described as a gallant old woman and of course a widow to boot. She and her chauffeur and manservant James Clarke, who was also Protestant, were killed on March 11th. Clarke, who was 50, had worked for her and her late husband since he was a boy. By all accounts, she was a kind of small, plump woman, very talkative, fiercely loyal. She had moved around Ireland, they were landed kind of aristocracy. She was born into a well-off Presbyterian family in Wicklow. She married John Lindsay from County Down, and they had lived in Coachford and Cork and Leamount, no children. Now, her death is very interesting because she had warned, she had tried to warn Strickland about an ambush that was going to happen here at Dripsey, which did take place in January. And so this is the letter that she apparently, sent to Strickland. Her crime in the eyes of the local IRA was informing on a planned IRA ambush at Godfrey's Cross, which was the picture there between the villages of Coachford and Dripsey. She had heard about the proposed ambush from a local grocer who told her not to take that road home through Dripsey to Ballincollig because there was a company of IRA men hiding out in anticipation of military passing by that way, January 28th. So she stopped off at the barracks in Ballincollig and told them, and told the local priest, Father Ned Shinnock, who had also kind of made a name for himself with the local IRA because he denounced the IRA from the altar. Shinnock, the priest, did tell Bustede, who was locally in charge of the IRA, but the IRA ignored Shinnock's warning. So the ambush party were taken by surprise when a detachment from the Manchester Regiment arrived on the scene as darkness was falling on the afternoon of January 28th. They were divided into 5 sections to surround the ambush party, which numbered 68 men. Now, 60 of the men were able to get away, these IRA men, but 8 were captured, along with 2 local men who just happened to be in the area and had nothing to do with the ambush. So these men were taken to Victoria Barracks in Cork and were subject to a hastily assembled military trial. 5 of them were sentenced to death: Daniel O'Callaghan, Patrick O'Mahony, Timothy McCarthy, and Thomas O'Brien. And I forgot the other guy's name. So news reached the IRA that the ambush had been foiled. They knew that Mrs. Lindsay had told not only Strickland, but also the priest. And so they went that night to Mrs. Lindsay's house and kidnapped her and her chauffeur, Clarke, burnt her house to the ground. A few days later, a messenger dropped a letter to Victoria Barracks in Cork, written in her own hand, allegedly. And they had a covering letter by the IRA to confirm its authenticity. So the IRA demanded that that these prisoners, the 5 men, would be released. It was addressed to Strickland. "I am a prisoner," she said, "and as I am sure you will know, and I have been told that it will be a very serious matter for me if these men are executed. I have been told that my life will be forfeited for theirs, as they believe that I was the direct cause of their capture. I implore you to spare these men for my sake." And then this was the IRA letter to say, yes, this is authentic. We know you, this is who we have. Strickland discussed the matter with General Neville MCCready, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in Ireland. The men agreed to proceed with the executions, calculating that the IRA would not shoot a woman. The executions proceeded on February 28th as planned. The men were executed at 15-minute intervals, along with the 6th prisoner, Sean Allen, who had not been involved at Dripsey but was in the barracks. So that evening in Cork, the IRA killed 6 British soldiers in revenge for the executions. And then on March 11th, Frank Bustede, the local IRA man, shot Lindsay and Clarke on their own. Bustede wrote of her, "The impression I got of her was that she was a stubborn woman, that you would not get any information from her. She wasn't cooperative, notwithstanding the fact that she was sentenced to death. I told her she was going to die. She never blinked an eye. I will say this for her bravery, she was excellent. But when I issued the sentence of death to Clarke, he collapsed completely. I don't know what you have there. Is it 2 different cultures, weak human nature, or what?" So it's actually kind of he had a horrific death, the poor man. Clarke was trembling so much that he had to be tied to 2 stakes that were driven into the ground to keep him upright. They dug a trench behind them, and Mrs. Lindsay, stood defiant and straight, and they were shot. Both victims fell into the pit, 2 meters long and 1 meter deep, and their bodies were never found. They are among 64 people in Cork who were disappeared by the IRA during the War of Independence. And now, as it is International Women's History Month, 98 women were killed in the war, according to a book, The Dead of the Irish Revolution, which was published by Eunine O'Halpine and Dahi O'Caron, which was 4% of the total killed. At least 3 were killed deliberately by the IRA as spies. So the others were Bridget Noble, also killed in Cork 4 days after Mrs. Lindsay, and Kate Carroll, who was killed in April in Monaghan. A very gendered world in 1920s. The deliberate killing of women provoked outrage, and Mrs. Lindsay's death did provoke a backlash, with the Morning Post devoting a page of letters in tribute to her. And this was his account, Frank Busteed, when he later applied for his pension. He just said, in March 1921, we arrested, so he had written captured, look, and he crossed it out. We arrested Mrs. Lindsay and driver as being spies. Both were executed later. We burned Mrs. Lindsay's house. At this period, military came in, something the area in search of the spies. The result was it gave our column all they could do to keep out of the rings around us. So, you know, killing this woman sort of put the pressure on the local IRA. So this, the dead of the Irish Revolution, authors concluded, in general, females were not regarded as legitimate targets for any of the contending forces. The deliberate killing of women, even as spies, aroused criticism within the revolutionary movement, but caused particular unease in IRA general headquarters. And I said they acted against the orders from Dublin. So the next kind of shocking event was the 6th of March, the murder of ex-Lord Mayor Michael Callaghan of Limerick and the current Lord Mayor at the time, George Clancy. And these were referred to as the Limerick curfew murders. Another volunteer, a third man volunteer, Joseph O'Donoghue, were all shot dead in their homes at night after curfew by a British spy, George Nathan, and assisted by auxiliaries. My grandmother was a Clancy. I don't think there was any relation, but she was taught by the widow of George Clancy, and she said that she had a scar. The woman was shot through her hand. She put out her hand to save her husband, and she was shot through the hand. So George Clancy, or Saoirse, the Gaelic word for George, was born in Grange, County Limerick. He was educated at Crescent College and then at Catholic University, which is now UCD, in St. Stephen's Green in Dublin. He was friendly with Francis Sheehy Skeffington, James Joyce, and Tom Kettle. He formed a branch of the Gaelic League at college and persuaded his friends, including Joyce, to take lessons in Irish. He played hurling and was a good friend of Michael Cusack, the founder of the GAA. He joined the Celtic Literary Society with Arthur Griffiths, so had, you know, very big involvement in the kind of Celtic revival, Gaelic League type stuff. So here he is with his wife Molly, or Mary, and you can see like he's wearing, you know, the Celtic Tara brooch, the kilt. What's his name, used to wear the kilt a lot as well before he went on hunger strike, the Lord Mayor of Cork. It'll come to me. And so, you know, very big into the Irish Celtic kind of nationalism. So he was originally a teacher at Congos Wood in college after graduation, but quite ill. So he returned to Limerick and taught the Irish language from about 1908. In 1913, he joined the Irish Volunteers, and in 1915, he married Moira, or Molly, also a teacher. He was arrested for his involvement in the 1916 Rising and imprisoned in Cork, but was released when he went on hunger strike before he came to trial. So he was elected Sinn Féin Mayor of Limerick in 1921, and he does actually feature in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. His character's name is Michael Devin. After his assassination, Clancy Street, which was a riverside street in Limerick, was named after him. When he was brought before the British court in 1916, he declared, "Níl Mass Madra Agum an Court Seo." I don't have a dog's respect for this court. So you're very vociferous. This was their funeral. The three of them were buried together. You can see in that one, the third coffin. But Kate O'Callaghan gave a very compelling testimony, and she went on to become one of the widows. We'll see her later on in the treaty negotiations too. So her testimony was, and very similar to what happened with Clancy, "I opened the door wide and I saw the two men with goggles and hats pulled down and coat collars up about their ears. My heart leapt in my breast. I knew it was murder. Both men said together, waving their revolvers at Michael, 'You coming out here, come out.' So, you know, they burst into their home. There's a curfew on, don't forget, but the men were at home. My mind worked like madness. I thought of the dark garden, of the river, of all the horrors, and stretching out both my arms to cover Michael, pushing him back behind me, I shouted, 'No, no, my God, not that.' I heard Michael say, 'No, no,' just twice, as the men advanced after us in the hall. I caught at their hands as they tried to get me out of the way. There was a struggle for a minute, and the man on my right hand, who had clear glasses and blue eyes, freed his right arm and fired over my shoulder. I turned to see Michael stagger from the hall table, against which I had pushed him, and he fell onto the mat at the foot of the stairs. In my agony, I relaxed my hold of the man, and that same devil slipped past me and emptied his revolver into my dear husband's body as he lay on the ground. I was struggling with the other man, the man whose voice had brought me downstairs, but as the man who had shot Michael was passing us to go out, I flew at him. I had the strength of a maniac. We three fought together in the hall while I screamed all the time. I knocked them twice. As our feet slipped on the polished floor, my shoes fell off. I tore at their faces and heads instinctively. They never said a word, but beat me with their hands on the head, shoulders, and arms. We fell against the umbrella stand, and at last, with an effort, they threw me off, and I fell heavily on my hip on the floor. I shall never forget the agony I suffered as I lay there screaming and helpless while I watched them running down the grass in the shaft of light from the hall door. I crawled back to my husband and fell across his body. With all my being, I cried out to God to spare him to me. I had never seen anyone die, but from the first shot, there was no hope. His eyes were closed, and he just gave a little sigh. So the three Republicans were buried together in the Republican plot in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery in Limerick. And so his widow, Kathleen O'Callaghan, as I say, went on to give, massive testimony. She was a huge PR boost for Sinn Féin. This is Michael, the ex-Lord Mayor. Clancy had taken over from him. And there's Kathleen. And she becomes very involved in politics right the way up. There she is again. So she's one of these widows, Terence McSweeney's widow, and Padraig Pearse's mother too was used. So they were called the so-called Black Widows, and these were elected. Kate O'Callaghan was elected to Dáil Éireann in 1921 and rejected the treaty, as many of the women did in January 22. Asked whether she would take an anti-treaty stance, or whether she would be taking an anti-treaty stance had she been granted an independent judicial inquiry into her husband's death, she replied that if that demand were granted now, it would not change the conviction which was bred in me and strengthened by his murder, that England and the British Empire have always stood in Ireland for evil and suffering. And as long as it is in my power to vote against the inclusion of Ireland in the British Empire, I will do so. So these women were not for compromise with the treaty, afterwards. And I suppose particularly anyone who had buried a husband or son, or brother, felt very strongly that why should they die for a compromise, So she lost her Dáil seat in 1923 and retired. And then again, here's one of, in the Sinn Féin propaganda, General Crosier to the real Hun: if you want to shoot mayors of Irish cities through the bodies of their wives, alluding to Clancy, if you want to burn Irish cities and murder ministers of religion, you'll have to do the bloody work yourself. I resign. So, they shot through the body of this woman to try to kill her. Crosier resigned because he was not in agreement with Lloyd George as to this method of reconquering Ireland, that they had kind of lost control of the forces. Now, there is an interesting little addendum here to this man, George Nathan, who was the murderer, they say, of the three men. He was a Londoner, had fought in the First World War and then joined the auxiliaries, arriving in Ireland in the autumn of 1920, and was identified as one of these murderers on the 6th or the 7th of March when Clancy and Callaghan were killed. He later was fighting with the International Brigade, fighting for the Spanish Republic against Franco, with Irish men serving under him. So knowing of his former membership of the auxiliaries, some Irish members of the brigade objected to him being placed in a position of command. When confronted, he admitted his role, but sort of to what extent it was never really, known. But it seems that his military skills and apparent commitment to the Spanish Republican cause saved him from retribution of the Irish men under his command in Spain. He was killed, however, at a battle in July of 1937. So it's interesting how these men popped up. You kind of think that the Black and Tans or auxiliaries fade, into back to England or whatever, but he popped up in Irish people's lives again, And then the last one we look at tonight is Crossbarry. So this was one of the biggest, events of the war. Crossbarry happened on March 19th, 20 kilometres southwest of Cork City. An IRA column, about 100 soldiers strong, under Tom Barry and Liam Deasy, escaped from an encircling manoeuvre by roughly 1,200 British troops and managed to kill between 10 and 30 of them. So the West Cork Brigade have been playing a blinder, sort of throughout this February and March time. And so there was a spate of arrests and interrogation of suspected IRA members in West Cork in an effort to ascertain the identities, you know, headquarters, where they could kind of try to stop all of this guerrilla warfare against the British. In February, the IRA, I think we talked about this in February, had mounted the ambush at the train station in Upton. Remember that? It was kind of a complete disaster. The army were sitting throughout the train. 6 civilians were killed and 3 IRA men killed. Other volunteers had been captured. And so British succeeded in breaking an IRA volunteer from that disaster under torture. And they discovered that the West Cork Brigade had headquarters in Ballymurphy. The British also learned that Tom Barry's column had returned to this area recently after several days waiting to ambush something on the Kinsale to Bandon road. And so the British commanders planned a major operation to try to, you know, knock out one of these, this particular IRA column. So they mobilized about 1,200 troops to converge on the area at Crossbarry from different directions. Tom Barry says that there was 400 troops coming from Cork City, 200 from Ballincollig, 300 from Kinsale and 350 from Bandon. 120 auxiliaries also left Macroom. So the sweep was, you know, they were going to go in and sort of sweep the countryside, ordered for the 19th. At Crossbarry, some of the troops descended from their lorries to proceed on foot and by bicycle to try to catch the IRA column unaware. An early victim of the action was Charlie Hurley, who was the IRA officer commanding the Cork No. 3 Brigade. Hurley was trapped in a house and killed at 6:30 in the morning. Tom Barry only became aware of danger at the very last minute, and he resolved that his men, only 100 of them, would have to fight their way out of this growing encirclement. Barry's calculation was that his men, who had about 40 rounds, imagine now, per men, could not sustain an all-day fight, which they could expect if they were managed to be pinned down by the British. So the likelihood was that the small column, of course, would be trapped. Barry observed, however, that one of the British columns advancing towards Crossbarry was well ahead of the other British units. So if his men could break through that smaller force, which was about the same size as his own, they could break through the circle. So Barry decided to lay an ambush in turn for the British at those crossroads at Crossbarry. Let me just go back to show you. Oh, I might have it in another slide. His men were in position by about 5:30 in the morning. The first British lorries, possibly as many as 12 of them, showed up, reached Crossbarry, but were caught by surprise. And they were hit by, I just want you to be able to see that quote. They were hit by crossfire at very close range, about only 5 to 10 yards. They took significant casualties and fled the scene. Barry's men collected the British arms and ammunition before setting fire to the lorries. At this point, they were now under attack from about 200 from another British unit coming from the southwest, and they were, had been caught in this other fire. So knowing that 2 other British units were converging, also trying to dislodge the IRA from their ambush position, the IRA was able to retire and kind of pull back. Taking the chance offered by his quick victory to get away, Barry marched his men to safety, while the British were still disoriented by the ambush. There was a brief exchange of fire at long range as the IRA column got away, which lasted for about an hour in total. Major Percival of the Essex Regiment, on realising what had happened, rushed to the scene with his troops, but he was only able to open long-range fire on the fleeing IRA men. He blamed the action on the auxiliary column, which had gone to the wrong rendezvous point. And so there had been, he says, a gap was left in the encirclement. There was a little bit of engagement with the IRA further at the line of retreat at Crow Hill, but no further casualties on either side. Barry claims that only 3 of his men were killed and 3 were wounded. British accounts claim that 6 IRA men had died. The IRA claims that over 30 British soldiers were killed in the action. The British admitted to just 10 being killed and 3 being wounded. RIC memorial records that 1 RIC constable and 6 soldiers were killed. So like that might be as many as 17, the British figures might have kind of deliberately made a distinction between RIC and the soldiers. So the British Army tried to chalk up this debacle to bad luck. Many believe that the defeat actually had a profound effect on British leadership, as well as their morale. So it shook their faith in the military's ability to defeat the volunteers in the field, and may have been one of this resurgence in an idea of a truce. Barry believed it has been, quote, a decisive factor in getting the British establishment to think of a truce. This ambush was followed up a couple of days later in Headford, near Killarney, where the IRA in Kerry ambushed a train, and 20 British soldiers were killed, as well as 2 IRA volunteers. Again, the British reported only 7 dead and 12 wounded. And so, you know, this kind of, the IRA were certainly pinning them down in Cork and Kerry. There's Crossbarry. So the Dáil. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that it had been 2 years since the violence started, the same day that the first Dáil opened, the 21st of January in 1919 at Solhabeg in Tipperary. And the Irish side had not actually declared war either. In fact, the first year and a half or 2 years, the IRA were more or less operating on their own. There was no direct involvement. Remember, we've kind of talked about this before, that Colbrua was Minister for Defence, but wasn't really ordering them. You know, a lot of the ordering was being done by certainly Michael Collins and his role over the IRB and the volunteers. So the volunteers, which is really what most of the men called themselves, did not become the Irish Republican Army until around this time. I said to you last month, when De Valera came back in December, he was kind of troubled by the ambiguous relationship between the Dáil and the IRA. And so he wanted something more formalized. And he also did not like this whole guerrilla warfare thing. He advocated for kind of big gestures like the 1916 Rising had been done. So in fact, I need to get my timing right. In January 1921, at the first Dáil meeting after De Valera's return from America, he introduced a motion calling on the IRA to stop holding ambushes and other tactics that were allowing the British to successfully portray the IRA as a terrorist group, and instead to take them on with conventional military methods. The Dáil, not to mind the IRB council, but the Dáil strongly opposed this. Then the Dáil debated whether it was feasible, quote, to accept formally a state of war that was being thrust on them or not, and decided in January not to declare war. And it's interesting because at this time the British are referring to war in documents, but it's never been called war, you know, by either side. De Valera issued a statement expressing support for the IRA in January 21 and claimed that it was fully under the control of the Dáil. So he, along with Colbrua and Austin Stack, then decide to try to pressure Michael Collins that he should go to the US and kind of take over the fundraising where De Valera left off. But Collins successfully resisted this move and stayed in Ireland. So then they kind of continued to debate. On the 30th of March in 1921, De Valera gave a statement to the press. From the Irish volunteers, he said, we have fashioned the Irish Republican Army to be the military arm of the government. The government is therefore responsible for the actions of this army. These actions are not the acts of irresponsible individuals or groups. And he went on to accuse the English of waging upon us not only an unjust, but a barbarous war. And on the 11th of March, the Dáil asked for acceptance of a state of war with England. The Dáil unanimously voted to empower De Valera to declare war when he saw fit, but he did not formally do so. So an interesting kind of juxtaposition there, where both sides are kind of referring to it as a war, but it had never been declared openly. So we'll take questions if anybody has, or comments, and I'm just going to briefly check in with Facebook to see what are they saying. So you can either unmute yourself or put the question in the chat.
Elizabeth, it's Joe Doherty. How you doing?
Yeah, Joe and Pat, how are you? Good.
Good. I just finished the book that I picked up at the book sale you had down there about Christmas. Michael Collins and by Tim Pat
Coogan.
Boy, detailed, and the number of names, and trying to remember both the sides, and when some people switch back and forth. And
yeah,
you guys had a complicated 4 or 5 years there, you know?
Oh, it's terrible. And like, you know, obviously all of the same people on West are killed, but because it obviously goes from War of Independence into Civil War,
Right.
and it is hard to keep track of who's on what, because, you know, they initially had all been on the same side. So I don't know how we're going to, it's going to be difficult, even in Ireland, you know, to kind of commemorate that, the Civil War, because now they're all on the same page, you know, and
Right.
by 1922 they are not. So like, it's interesting, those women, you know, break very quickly. Certainly the IRA Council breaks very quickly, you know, it's a tough one. But yeah, so you'll see the same names again and again. And
they kept referring to I think the War of Independence as the Black and Tan War.
yeah. So some people call it that. It's maybe, I mean, I always call it the War of Independence, but you know, it is the Black and Tan War. They call it that too, yeah. And then the Civil War afterwards. Mm-hmm.
And then they said there's going to be a debate on how they commemorate the 100th anniversary of Collins's killing.
Yeah, you know, it is going to be very, like, we've already run into certain issues at home already, you know, because some of the RIC, for instance, that were killed were Irish Catholic, sometimes Irish speaking, you know, and so they were viewed at the time, you know, as traitors and as agents of a foreign occupying body, you know, blah, 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 which of course they were. But like 100 years later, their descendants are still living in, like, you know, Tom Crean's brother, you know, was an RIC man. And so how can you not celebrate Tom Crean, you know, and he joined the British Navy, you know, but was away with Shackleton and all that, you know, so he never took part in the War of Independence. But it's very difficult, like when there's Irish people living at home in Ireland, you know, their descendants are there and they were on the wrong side for the War of Independence. But as you say, we're going to come upon that in the Civil War, because, I mean, De Valera's descendants are still in politics, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. McKenna that I just mentioned, his descendants are involved in local politics in Kerry. So it's a very, very messy, you know, tentative subject. Mm-hmm.
Good luck.
Yeah. Thank you. We actually might do a lecture about that, about commemoration, because every time I think about it, I think about the debate here, you know, to do with Confederacy and statues and monuments. So to be an interesting transatlantic thing, I think, to look at.
Yeah.
You know. Anyone else? Questions or comments?
I have a question.
Patrick.
Did I misunderstand the numbers? I thought I heard 60,000 total British and auxiliary troops in the area of Kerry and Cork, and 300 IRA. Was I mistaken?
There was about, I think, 1,000 of the IRA,
okay,
if not more. But really, there was only 3,000 throughout the country, so there was roughly 1,000, we'll say, in Munster. I thought I did say that figure tonight.
And were there 60,000 British troops?
Yeah,
regular British troops?
There was definitely, 60,000 British troops and 15,000 police.
Good heavens.
Yeah. So horribly outnumbered, you know, absolutely horribly outnumbered. Yeah.
The odds were impossible.
Yeah. But you know what?
No wonder they had to resort to ambush.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think De Valera's idea, and I mean, they do this when they, you know, they kind of occupy the forecourts later before the thing in June. Disastrous, you know, like you're pinning everybody down into one place that's awful easy to blow the hell out of it. You know, they saw that in 1916, the Helga sails up the river, you know, so like tactically it's not good when you have that tiny amount of a fighting force to put them all in one space, you know, and they really don't have enough arms or supplies, you know. So, you know, this idea like that we would look better if we engaged in kind of more acceptable military tactics, you know. Yeah, but it is like one of the articles I read talked about, like, kind of compared this IRA fight to Vietnam and how the Viet Cong fought, you know, kind of disappearing in and out and the use. And so I suppose we might have become used to sort of an urban warfare or a guerrilla style warfare, but it was kind of new, you know, when Michael Collins proposed it, you know. Or these fine columns proposed it.
But it had existed when Michael Dwyer was in Wicklow.
Yeah.
the same kind of tactics against the redcoats.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and I mean, they had, you know, the pikemen and all. When you have a tiny force, you know, that's outnumbered by a greater the empire, you know, I don't know how you would expect to engage with them unless it was short and sharp and, you know, out the door again. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, Elizabeth, this is Pat Doherty. I'm wondering how much influence or financial or materials came from America during that time. I mean, de Valera had been there trying to raise sympathies or whatever. So I'm wondering just how much of the arms that they got did come via American input.
That's a brilliant question. And Pat, the sad answer is not enough. You know, De Valera was very clever. They were begging at home, like they wanted arms and ammunition, and De Valera was collecting money and not necessarily shipping at home. So like there was an awful lot of cash on deposit. You know, they had raised a little bit of cash themselves at home. Collins had launched, you know, that bond, but not enough. So, I mean, this is, I can't remember the exact total, you know, it turns out to be millions in modern day, but like this is sort of hidden, you know, because the association here, the Friends of Irish Freedom, or, you know, De Valera divides that movement in half. So some of the money stays with the Americans, some of it goes to his new thing, the Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic, you know, and eventually he brings it over and buys himself a newspaper, you know. So it was, I mean, I find it hard to be not cynical when it comes to De Valera. Anyone else? Isn't it interesting how much is, and I mean, it's not fair to the rest of the country, but certainly an awful lot of activity in Cork and Kerry. You know, there was a little bit up in kinds of the Galway Mayo, we looked at that, and then Longford, and even Monaghan under Ernest Bly, but the, you know, the Munster province especially, and a lot of it had started in Tipperary, you know, but I suppose as the men get pinned down or arrested, the action kind of moves, you know, wherever the men can be mobile, you know. So, and I suppose as well where the civilian population can support them.
Were there any Americans that came over to actually physically help fight?
There were, I can't remember one of the names off the top of my head, but there were, it was actually surprising how many, you know, that some of them were, had been born in Ireland and moved over and then came back to fight, but a number of them, particularly a lot of New Yorkers, you know, from the city, a few from Boston too. So like McCartan, and there was a good few men involved, you know. It was interesting, and of course they are coming back and forth here all the time. Women are coming over to give talks, so that PR drive, you know, continued when De Valera went home with the McSweeney women. Markievicz had been here earlier, like it was, you know, at the end of the month we're having that talk. What's her name, Mary McCowan from a village outside Listowel, but she teaches at UCD. She's going to give a talk about the women, like French Mullins and Kathleen Lynn, and about 3 or 4 others who came over to America to kind of fundraise and raise awareness, and she'll be back. Oh, so good. Yeah, it's interesting.
Good. Interesting.
Anyone else got any questions or comments? Are you still there, Chris? You are. I thought you'd love all the Cork stories.
Yeah, it was very interesting. And I know down where my grandfather came from on the Mizzen Peninsula, even down there at the very end of the country, there was a lot, both in the War of Independence and the Civil War. In Crookhaven, they burned down the Coast Guard station in the Civil War. There was a RIC barracks, I think, in the War of Independence. I mean, even very rural places, there was a lot of disturbance.
Yeah, it was nearly worse, you know, in some of these smaller areas, I think. Thanks, Gina and Bob, in the Civil War, you know, because I suppose there was more at stake in one way, you know. So I just saw it was the anniversary of Ballyseedy in Kerry, which we won't talk about until 22. But, you know, these men were neighbours, like, you know, so people that were fighting together at this point in time, by this time next year, are, you know, killing each other. It is terrible. And like there's, you know, they know that it's kind of all or nothing, because you are competing for those small few arms or for control of the station, you know, which will allow you to have the communication. So, you know, that's, I think, what's terrible about the Civil War is the destruction actually amps up in one way, you know.
Yeah.
So if that's it, I don't think anyone else has any questions. We'll certainly do April. We'll do April. In April, I haven't set a date yet for that. And then we have a number of talks. You know, tomorrow we're doing the baking bread demonstration with Harold at 3 o'clock, but that will be available hopefully on Facebook. We're doing on Friday a concert with John Kelly, and Sunday we have a concert from a fella in Ireland, so that we're paying, that's a paid one, but he's very good. Andreas Stack, he's from Galway, kind of a Shanachie. And then we have a number of talks. Chris, yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. Now thinking about it, my grandmother from outside of Castle Gregory on the Dingle Peninsula, she emigrated in July of 1920. So this is right in the middle of this. Did you know? There's all this disturbance, but I guess people were still able to emigrate and travel to some extent during this period.
You know, it had totally slowed down, of course, because of World War I and things.
Right.
And I would say a lot of people, maybe not that I'm putting your grandmother in that category, but some people probably did have to leave, you know, a little bit. Thanks, Jeff. So, you know, from that point of view too, it's interesting that, you know, if you had a price in your head, now was the time to go, you know, from whichever side.
Because I've always found that interesting. My grandmother, as I say, left in July of 20, but my grandfather down in West Cork didn't leave until April of 23. Yeah. So it's like he was there for the whole Civil War and then left.
Yeah. Well, and you know, you could kind of, so he might have been involved, you know, and wanted to see it through, or had been younger, you know, and maybe like the Civil War was the thing that put the, you know, that, oh, I can't stay in this country, we're too messed up, you know. I'd say like there must have been a little bit of trauma sort of involved with people, you know, too, that kind of survived it, you know.
Right. Yeah, well, he wasn't young. He was 26 or 27 when he emigrated. So I think it's more likely he might have been. Probably
had been involved, even at a lower level, you know, like, I would say it would be very hard for a single man or even a woman, you know. The women did a lot of the kind of reconnaissance and the spying or the carrying of food to them, you know. I'm sure there was a lot of that level of involvement, you know, by younger people. Like when you think about even the leaders, like Michael Collins was only 30, barely 30 something, you know, when he was killed. So like these are young men, like, and so then the soldiers must have been 17 to 30 kind of, you know. Yeah. So no questions there. I'm just going to quickly look over on Facebook in case there's a question. The Listowel RIC mutiny, we covered that. But that is what's interesting, you know, that there is this kind of pushback from some of the RIC even, because they, you know, they are Irish themselves, a lot of them.
Yes.
So if no one has any other questions, we'll leave it there. And I hope to see you at some of the other events this month. Check us in, and anyone who wants to do the 5K or 10K run, it's all virtual, so you can still sign up. And we've lovely swag for you, which hasn't been delivered yet. It'll come this weekend. But check out our Facebook page. And hey, Kathy, thank you for coming in. Thank you. And
there's a 5K walk count.
Pardon?
I said there's a 5K walk count.
Oh yeah, you've been wild to be walking it. I certainly won't be running. But yeah, thank you all, and have a great Irish American Heritage Month, and happy St. Patrick's Day. But I'm sure I'll see you before that. I'm looking forward to Friday's concert.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone, have a good night. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye bye.